Hill 875, dusk. The 173rd Airborne clings to a muddy ridgeline, surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. A radio man screams the only words that matter: "We need air support now." Moments later, an A-4 Skyhawk roars low over the jungle canopy. In the chaos of one of Vietnam's fiercest battles, two 250-pound bombs fall tragically short, exploding inside the American perimeter and devastating the battalion command post. 42 paratroopers are killed in seconds. This is the story of the worst friendly fire incident of the Battle of Dak To, and one of the deadliest combat mistakes of the Vietnam War.
Daniel Whitfield had turned 19 3 weeks before he set foot in Vietnam. Back in Millersburg, Ohio, he'd worked at his uncle's hardware store, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. And the biggest decision most days was whether to restock nails before or after lunch. He enlisted because 2 of his older cousins had gone before him, because the draft board was going to call him eventually anyway, and because some part of him believed, the way most 19-year-olds believe things, that nothing truly bad happened to people who tried to do the right thing. By November of 1967, he was a rifleman in the 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, part of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the first major Army combat unit to set foot in Vietnam, men who called themselves Sky Soldiers and wore that name like armor. The brigade had already fought through Operation Junction City. Through ambushes and firefights that had killed friends Whitfield had eaten breakfast with that same morning. None of it had prepared him for Dak To. The battle had begun weeks earlier, when a North Vietnamese Army sergeant defected and walked into an American camp with information that changed everything. 4 enemy infantry regiments and an artillery regiment were massing in Kon Tum province, preparing what intelligence officers believed could be the largest communist offensive the Central Highlands had ever seen. The target was Dak to itself, and possibly the destruction of an entire American brigade in the process. What followed was a campaign of escalating violence across a string of nameless hills and ridgelines that most Americans back home would never learn the names of. Hill 823, Ngok Kom Leet, each one a separate battle in its own right, each one bleeding the brigade a little more before the real objective even came into view. Hill 875, a steep, heavily forested promontory that the North Vietnamese had spent weeks turning into a fortress. Most American commanders didn't yet understand they were walking into. The hill itself was deceptive. From a distance, it looked like any other ridge in the Central Highlands. Thick bamboo, broken tree limbs, the kind of terrain that swallowed visibility past 50 meters in every direction. What the jungle hid was a network of bunkers, with overhead cover thick enough to survive a direct artillery hit. Spider holes invisible until a man was standing on top of one, and fields of fire the North Vietnamese had calculated to the meter, sighted in weeks before the first American boot ever touched the slope. On the morning of November 19th, 3 companies of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, moved up that slope to take the hill. Would you have kept walking forward, knowing what waited above? The men climbing that morning didn't have the luxury of knowing. What they had was a mission, a hill, and an enemy who had let them walk directly over the top of hidden positions before rising up behind them, cutting off any path back down. The lead companies were surrounded within minutes of first contact, pinned on ground that offered almost no cover and no way out. Whitfield's company, part of the 4th Battalion, was ordered up as reinforcement that same afternoon. They fought their way up through terrain that had already been chewed apart by hours of contact, linking up with the survivors of the 2nd Battalion's lead elements by midday. But linking up didn't mean relief. It meant inheriting the same trap. A perimeter barely large enough to call a perimeter, exposed on every side, ringed by an enemy force that showed no intention of withdrawing and every intention of finishing what it had started. By afternoon, the math of the battle had turned brutal and simple. American artillery couldn't get close enough to the North Vietnamese positions without risking the same men it was meant to protect. Airstrikes were the only weapon left capable of reaching bunkers dug in just meters from the perimeter, so close that forward observers had to call corrections measured in single meters, not the hundreds of meters that normally separated friendly troops from a bombing run. Whitfield and the men around him understood, without anyone needing to say it out loud, that they were about to ask aircraft to drop high explosives closer to American lives than any safety margin was ever designed to allow. But here's where everything changed, because the same closeness that made airstrikes necessary was about to make them catastrophic. The call went out just after 1600 hours. Close air support, immediate. Target the bunker line less than 70 meters from the American perimeter. Captain Harold Kaufman, commanding the forward elements on the hill, relayed the coordinates himself, reading them back twice over the radio to make sure there was no error on his end. 70 meters was not a comfortable distance for high explosives. It was the distance commanders accepted only when the alternative, letting the assault stall under fire while wounded men waited for evacuation that couldn't come until the perimeter held, was worse. Whitfield watched the first flights come in high, well clear of the perimeter, hammering targets farther down the ridgeline where the danger of hitting friendly positions was minimal. Those strikes felt like relief. They were precise, controlled, exactly what air support was supposed to look like from the ground. For a few minutes, men who hadn't stopped moving or firing in hours let themselves believe the worst of the day might already be behind them. Would you have trusted that next radio call, knowing exactly how close the enemy really was? The men on that hill didn't have much choice in the matter. The terrain had narrowed their options down to one path forward: call fire in close enough to actually hurt the enemy, and trust that the men flying overhead would thread a needle most pilots never had to thread in training. If this story has pulled you in already, you understand something most people miss about Vietnam. It wasn't one war fought the same way every day. It was thousands of impossible decisions made in minutes, by men who had no good options left, only less terrible ones. This channel exists to tell those decisions honestly, without flattening them into easy judgment after the fact. If that matters to you the way it matters to us, the subscribe button is right there. And it means more than you'd think to a channel built entirely on stories like this one. By late afternoon, the light over Hill 875 was already starting to fail. November in the central Highlands meant dusk arrived fast and without much warning. And by 1600 hours, the jungle canopy was already thick with something worse than darkness. Hours of artillery and napalm had filled the air with black, rolling smoke that hung low over the hill and refused to clear. Forward air controllers, the men responsible for guiding pilots onto the correct target and away from friendly lines, were trying to mark the boundary using smoke grenades and colored ground panels, methods that depended entirely on visibility nobody on that hill still had. A new aircraft was inbound, a single A-4 Skyhawk carrying Mk-81 Snake-Eye bombs, configured specifically for close support work where retarded fall let pilots drop ordnance near friendly troops without the bomb traveling forward into them on impact. The pilot flying it had already logged multiple sorties that day over Dak To, one mission folding into the next without much real rest in between. The kind of fatigue that builds quietly and doesn't announce itself until it matters. He was handed coordinates for a strike closer to the perimeter than almost anything flown that day. What the official investigation would later try to reconstruct, piece by piece, was just how much that accumulated smoke, that dying light, and that quiet fatigue had narrowed the margin for error down to almost nothing at all. The Skyhawk came in low, banking hard against a crosswind, the pilot fighting to hold the target in sight through haze that swallowed landmarks whole. From the cockpit, the line between friendly and enemy positions, a line that existed clearly enough on a map back at the operations center, was nearly impossible to distinguish on the ground below. Smoke didn't respect boundaries drawn in grease pencil. Burning trees looked the same whether they stood over American foxholes or North Vietnamese bunkers, and from several hundred feet up, moving fast in failing light, a few dozen meters of drift looked like nothing at all. Below, the forward air controller keyed his radio one final time, reading the strike coordinates back to the pilot and confirming the position of friendly troops relative to the target line. A routine call repeated hundreds of times that day across the battle for Dak To, one that had worked every previous time it mattered. On the ground, men listened to that exchange crackle over company radios and understood it as the last checkpoint before the only kind of help left arrived from the sky. Whitfield and the men packed into that narrow perimeter heard the aircraft's engine grow louder, then watched it bank directly overhead, lining up on a run that would pass almost directly above the command post. Every man on that ground understood exactly what was coming next. They pressed themselves into whatever cover existed. A shallow trench scraped out that morning, a bomb crater left by an earlier strike, the lee side of a fallen tree still smoking from napalm dropped hours before. Sergeant Major Ted Arthurs, moving low between positions to check on wounded men staged for evacuation, called out for everyone near the command post to get flatter against the ground than they already were. For a few seconds, the only sound on the hill was the Skyhawk's engine, rising in pitch as it committed to the run. The pilot released his bombs. The first explosion landed precisely where it was meant to land, on the North Vietnamese line, a clean strike, exactly the kind of support the men below had been praying for since the call went out an hour earlier. For one breath, something on that hill almost felt like relief. There was no time for it to last. The second bomb followed less than a second behind the first. Its fall line drifted just enough, just barely enough, to put it on the wrong side of a boundary that smoke and dying light had already erased from anyone's view, in the air or on the ground. It detonated almost directly above the American perimeter, above the command post, above the collection point where the most severely wounded men had been gathered hours earlier to wait for a medevac that still hadn't come. What happened in the next 4 seconds would change everything that followed on that hill, and it had nothing to do with the enemy at all. The blast wave hit before the sound did. Whitfield felt the ground itself jump beneath him, a violence that traveled up through his chest before his ears caught up and registered the explosion as noise. Dirt and shredded bamboo rained down across the perimeter. For several seconds, nobody moved, because nobody could tell yet whether the next sound would be a second bomb, or the silence of men trying to understand what had just happened to them. Then, the screaming started. It came from the direction of the command post, from the collection point where the wounded had been staged, and it didn't stop. Whitfield was closer to that ground than almost anyone still capable of moving, and what he found when he crawled toward it was a crater where a cluster of men had been lying minutes earlier, men who had already given everything they had just to survive long enough to be evacuated. Some of them were gone outright. Others were wounded again, wounded on top of wounds that had already cost them everything they had left to give. Captain Kaufman, who had called in the strike himself, was among the casualties near the command post. The radio operator who had relayed those coordinates twice to make sure there was no error was dead. In the space of 4 seconds, The hill had lost the men responsible for coordinating its defense, its communication with the units below, and its connection to the artillery and air support that had been keeping the North Vietnamese at bay all afternoon. What would you have done in that position? Keep fighting or try to make sense of what had just happened to your own men? There wasn't time for either, not really. The North Vietnamese hadn't stopped firing. If anything, the confusion and the sudden silence from American command frequencies seemed to draw renewed pressure from the tree line, probes testing whether the perimeter had broken along with its leadership. Whitfield moved between positions that no longer had anyone clearly in charge of them, doing what dozens of other surviving NCOs and privates were doing across that hillside, taking over radios nobody had assigned them, directing fire from men too dazed to direct themselves, dragging wounded toward whatever cover still existed. Sergeant Major Arthurs, who had been moving low through the perimeter calling for men to get flatter just moments before the bomb fell, was among those who began organizing a recovery effort almost immediately, pulling survivors out of the blast radius while small arms fire continued to crack overhead. The radio net, badly damaged but not entirely destroyed, carried fragments of traffic up and down the chain of command, confused, urgent, contradictory in places, as units tried to determine what had happened and whether it was safe to call in any more air support at all. For a stretch of time that felt far longer than it actually was, the men on Hill 875 were fighting two different battles simultaneously, the one against an enemy still dug into the tree line, and the one against the chaos that had just torn through their own command structure from above. Medics worked through the wreckage with what supplies remained, triaging men who had already been triaged once that day, now facing wounds layered on top of wounds. Some of the dead were men who had survived hours of direct combat, only to be killed by the aircraft sent to save them. Whitfield would carry that detail for the rest of his life, not the firefight itself, but the particular cruelty of watching men die from help that had been called in good faith, by officers doing exactly what they were trained to do, in conditions that had made the margin for error disappear entirely. By the time the immediate chaos began to settle into something resembling order, the sun had nearly finished setting over the central Highlands. The hill was still not taken. The enemy was still dug in, and the Americans holding that ground now had to fight through the night with a command structure that had been gutted by their own side, waiting for a dawn that would have to bring reinforcement if the position was going to hold at all. Reinforcement arrived with first light, though arrived understates what it took to get there. The 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry, attached from the 4th Infantry Division, pushed up toward Hill 875 from the south, through terrain just as hostile as anything the 173rd had already crossed, while additional companies of the 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, moved to close the gaps the previous day's chaos had torn open. For the men already on the hill, the sound of approaching American units wasn't relief exactly. Relief required more rest than anyone had gotten, but it was the first sign in 18 hours that the situation might stop getting worse before it got better. What changed the battle wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was the accumulation of firepower the Americans could finally bring to bear, once daylight and clearer skies restored the visibility that smoke and dusk had stolen the evening before. Artillery batteries that had been firing blind through haze now had clean lines of sight onto North Vietnamese positions. B-52 strikes, requested earlier but held back because of the proximity to friendly troops, became viable again as the front line stabilized, and the margin for error widened back out to something survivable. Which version of that night do you think the men actually believed? That command had failed them, or that command had done everything possible with what little visibility allowed? Both versions lived in that perimeter side by side, and neither one made the next 48 hours of fighting any easier. The North Vietnamese, for their part, had spent everything they had on the defense of Hill 875 and the broader Dak II campaign. Intelligence gathered from prisoners and captured documents in the days that followed revealed regiments that had been bled down to a fraction of their starting strength, units ordered to hold positions at any cost because withdrawal had stopped being an option their commanders were willing to authorize. The same fortified bunkers that had made the hill nearly impossible to take were now graves for men who never received the order to fall back. Over the next 4 days, the battle for Hill 875 became a grinding contest of attrition. Repeated assaults, repeated repulses, ground gained in meters and lost just as easily, while the wounded from the friendly fire incident were finally evacuated in waves as helicopters found windows of relative safety to land. Whitfield's company held a section of the perimeter that changed hands in small, costly increments, every advance paid for in casualties that arrived faster than replacements could fill the gaps. The momentum, when it finally shifted slowly and without any single turning point anyone could point to afterward. It was the weight of artillery, air power, and sheer numerical persistence wearing down an enemy that had chosen to stand and fight, rather than melt back into the jungle the way North Vietnamese units so often did, when the cost of holding ground exceeded what they were willing to pay. On November 23rd, Thanksgiving Day, the 2nd and 4th Battalions of the 503rd Infantry made their final push to the crest of Hill 875. They found it already abandoned. The North Vietnamese had pulled out sometime in the previous night, leaving behind a scattering of charred bodies and weapons, but no organized resistance left to meet the assault that finally reached the top. After 4 days of some of the fiercest fighting the war had produced, the hill that had cost so much to take fell not to one final dramatic assault, but to an enemy who had already paid more than it could afford to keep paying. That same day, the surviving paratroopers of the 173rd Airborne Brigade ate their Thanksgiving dinner in the trenches they had spent 4 days fighting and dying to hold. Turkey and trimmings flown in by helicopter, eaten in foxholes still scarred from artillery and the friendly fire that had torn through their own lines days earlier. Few of them would later describe it as a celebration. Most remembered it as something closer to disbelief, that they had survived long enough to eat a meal at all. The cost of the broader battle for Dak II, when the numbers were finally compiled, was staggering by any measure of the war. The fighting around Hill 875 alone had cost the 2nd Battalion 87 killed and over 130 wounded. The 4th Battalion lost 28 killed with well over 100 more wounded. Combined with losses elsewhere in the campaign, the toll represented roughly 1/5 of the entire 173rd Airborne Brigade's strength. 1 in 5 men either dead or wounded in a single, sustained battle. Who do you think bore the responsibility for what happened on that hillside? The pilot, the fog of war itself, or a chain of command that asked exhausted men to thread a needle no training had prepared them for? The official investigation into the friendly fire incident would take years to surface in any meaningful detail, and even then, much of what it concluded stayed buried in classified reports that survivors wouldn't see in their lifetime. For Daniel Whitfield, the cost wasn't measured in numbers. It was measured in names. Men he'd shared a tent with, men he'd watched die from wounds inflicted by their own side, men whose families would receive letters explaining a death in combat, without ever fully knowing that the danger had come from above rather than from the enemy in front of them. The brigade would be awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions during the Dak II campaign, an honor earned in the truest sense of the word, paid for in a currency no medal could ever really account for. Hill 875 itself, once the dust settled and the war moved on to other battles in other provinces, turned out to hold no lasting strategic value at all. It commanded no roads, controlled no population, guarded no resource worth fighting over. It was simply ground that had to be taken because the enemy had chosen to defend it, and because by the time anyone fully understood that, hundreds of American lives had already been spent proving the point. Decades later, military historians would point to Hill 875 as a case study in what happens when fog, fatigue, and proximity collapse the margin for error that close air support depends on to function safely. The tactics that made airstrikes so close to friendly lines necessary that day, the same tactics used successfully dozens of times earlier in the battle, were the same tactics that turned catastrophic the moment visibility disappeared. Nobody on that hill did anything outside the bounds of what they'd been trained and ordered to do. The system simply ran out of margin at the worst possible moment. The Army's after-action reports on DAC 2 acknowledged the ferocity of the fighting and the effectiveness of the firepower that ultimately broke the North Vietnamese defense, but friendly fire incidents like the one on Hill 875 rarely received the same public accounting as battlefield victories. For years, conflicting accounts circulated among the men who survived it, some blaming South Vietnamese aircraft that hadn't actually been present, a story that took root simply because it was easier to carry than the truth. It would take a properly conducted investigation, kept from public view for decades, to establish clearly what had actually happened above that hill at dusk. What stayed with men like Daniel Whitfield wasn't the question of blame. It was the weight of having survived a battle where the greatest danger, in the end, hadn't come from the enemy they'd been sent to fight. He carried that distinction quietly for the rest of his life, the way so many veterans of DAC 2 carried details they never fully explained to the people who loved them back home, not because the story was secret, but because some weight doesn't translate easily into words spoken at a kitchen table. The hill itself was abandoned by the military not long after the battle ended, its tactical value having expired the moment the fighting stopped. Today it exists mostly in memory, in reunion newsletters, in fading photographs, in the recollections of men who are fewer in number every year. What happened there on November 19th, 1967 remains one of the costliest single incidents of friendly fire in the entire war, and one of the least discussed.